Good evening and welcome to tonight's Fourscore Speaker Series with Dr. Lucas Morel. My name is Phyllis Evans and I'm the Senior Director of Development at the Lincoln Presidential Foundation. Our foundation is thrilled to now be leading and supporting efforts across the nation to share the story of Abraham Lincoln's life, legacy, and leadership. We hope that you will continue in your support of this new mission as we continue moving forward with our commitment to the unfinished work of our time. For more information, please visit our new website at lincolnpresidential.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I would like to remind you that we will entertain questions from the audience, so please type them in the Q&A box and we will get to as many as we possibly can. And now, please join me in welcoming our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson-Mast. Erin?
Thank you, Phyllis. Greetings, everyone, and thank you for joining us for another Fourscore Speaker Series program. On behalf of the Foundation, I'm delighted to welcome Lucas Morel for an in-depth discussion on his most recent book, Lincoln and the American Founding, published by Southern Illinois University Press as part of its Concise Lincoln Library series. As noted by the publisher, Dr. Morel argues in this persuasive work that the most important influence on Abraham Lincoln's political thought and practice was what he learned from the leading figures of and documents from the birth of the United States. In this systematic account of those principles, Morel compellingly demonstrates that to know Lincoln well is to understand thoroughly the founding of America. Lucas Morel is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He holds a PhD in political science from Claremont Graduate University. In addition to writing Lincoln and the American Founding, Morel is the author, editor, or co-editor of several other books, including Lincoln's Sacred Effort, Redefining Religion's Role in American Self-Government, Lincoln and Liberty, Wisdom for the Ages, Ralph Ellison and the Raft of Hope, A Political Companion to Invisible Man, and The New Territory, Ralph Ellison in the 21st Century. Dr. Morel conducts high school teacher workshops for the Ashbrook Center, Jack Miller Center, Gilder Lehrman Institute, Bill of Rights Institute, and Liberty Fund. He is a former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War, and currently serves on the U.S. Semiquincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America. During a recent sabbatical, he served as the Worsham Teaching Fellow at Hillsdale College's Van Andel Graduate School of Government in Washington, D.C., teaching courses on Frederick Douglass and the modern civil rights movement. Welcome, Lucas.
Thank you, Erin. Wonderful to be here.
To kick things off, please tell us how you came to the field of history, and then what inspired you to write this book in particular.
Okay, well, I was a junior in college back in Claremont McKenna College in Southern California, where I grew up. You could tell by my accent. And I took a course on political rhetoric, and it was taught by a professor named James Nichols. He was an expert on the Platonic dialogues, especially the Gorgias, which is about rhetoric. But he included excerpts from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And I just have to say the hook got in me then and has never been taken out. And true story, my senior year in Claremont, all the Claremont colleges, you have to write a senior seminar. And those usually only take a semester. In high school, I never wrote a paper longer than 10 pages. So I did not think I could write a senior seminar paper in one semester. So I chose to do an honors thesis, not to show off or anything. I just thought I need a year to do this thing. My original idea was to compare civil disobedience in Thoreau and Lincoln's early but very important speech, the young men, the Lyceum Address, otherwise known as On the Perpetuation of Our Political Institutions. So I gave that idea to my advisor and he said, nah, don't do that. He said, nobody's written anything interesting on the second inaugural. So 70 pages later, wow. I wrote my thesis on Lincoln's 4-paragraph, 701 word, I think is his greatest speech. And then I went on to continue with things focused on Lincoln and the American Founding when I went to graduate school, did my dissertation, which was my first book, Lincoln Sacred Effort. And I've just been teaching about Lincoln ever since, and that's, over 30 years now.
Wow. And how did you, so I mean, it sounds like in some cases, ancient history and learning about Lincoln and Douglas debates inspired you.
Yes.
What made you decide to write this book in particular on Lincoln and the American founding?
Yeah, this one's easy. I have been teaching Lincoln and the American founding for practically my whole academic career. I don't think you can, if you can teach Lincoln without teaching about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the compromises with slavery, you're doing something wrong. You are getting something super fundamentally wrong with Lincoln. But I'm going to share something here. I don't know if Sylvia and the folks at SIU are going to get mad at me, but they actually wanted me to write a book on Lincoln and civil rights, because I also do courses on race and America. Race and equality is an annual course that I teach. That's why I teach Frederick Douglass, among other people. And so yeah, I said to her, you know what, I really don't have in mind a book like that for your Concise Lincoln Library series, but would you guys consider a book on Lincoln and the American founding? And she said, ooh, that sounds interesting. Send us a proposal. And they were very patient with me. The book took way longer than it should have. They want them short. It's 122 pages between the boards, but I had to lop off like about 5,000 or 6,000 words, and it felt like cutting off a limb. But they wanted these books to be written by scholars, but for laypersons. In other words, written with no jargon, and they don't even really like the footnotes, but I insisted on the footnotes. And so that's how we ended up producing this book. And I say, if you read that book and you think I get Lincoln wrong, then I need to find a new line of work.
Nice. Well, I also love that you went from, at the beginning of your story, talking about coming to the field, having never written a paper longer than 10 pages, and now with your most recent book, having to lop off 6,000 words because it was too long.
That was torture.
I do have to say that the whole series is wonderful for the reasons you point out, that it is concise, and I think it makes it more accessible.
Yes.
And a big part of what we do, and for you, the history field, for me, more public history side of things, is to make sure that the latest and greatest scholarship is accessible to the broadest number of people. So that's wonderful. And I really personally appreciate that you pitched the idea and they accepted it immediately. So I'm not surprised. It's one of those topics that's both timely and timeless.
I think so.
Lucas, which founders were most influential when it came to Abraham Lincoln's political ideology and view of what America was?
Yeah, two come right to mind, and they are the ones that I focus on in the first two chapters. And the first chapter is on the founder, George Washington. I mean, this is beyond debate. No Washington, no America. And so I spend that chapter looking at what it is that Lincoln specifically drew from Washington: his character, his piety, his emphasis on the union of the states, his resolution. And here's just a man who was an establisher and defender of the American regime, when it was a gleam in his eye until he stepped down from office, remarkably after 2 terms, when he could have easily been appointed to a third. But as I'm quick to say in the book, more important than an actual person, an actual founder, is a founding document. So if I had to mention a second founder, it would have to be, and this is odd because they were of two different parties, it would be Thomas Jefferson, not because of Jefferson's politics, but because of what you call his ideology or his political way of thinking, and best expressed, obviously, in the draft that he came up with for the Declaration of Independence, and the Second Continental Congress kept most of it. So without question, if I had to pick one thing, and it is without, no coincidence, just the longest chapter. I almost made it 2 chapters, but the longest chapter is chapter 2, and it's on Lincoln and the Declaration of Independence. And that spells out the aims or the ends of the regime. It's basically our mission statement as a country. And it's just incredible, especially when you get to the 1850s and into his presidency, but certainly in the 1850s, when Lincoln is really seeing the country derailing in a way and becoming something he doesn't recognize as a citizen. It's astounding how often he directs the citizens' attention to the Declaration of Independence. And so I spent a lot of time in that chapter laying out particular aspects of the Declaration, especially the political theory of the Declaration, and corollary things like the right to rise,
Mhm.
that aren't explicitly spelled out in the Declaration, but that Lincoln inferred from the principles of it.
Yeah, well, and I appreciate that in your book, there's also it's how he views the Declaration of Independence, but then also his understanding of the US Constitution.
Oh yeah.
But certainly to your point, from a vision, a mission, and aspirational standpoint, he relies far more on the Declaration of Independence for that and the soaring language and the principles that are in that document. So digging into that a little more, what was his understanding of what the Declaration of Independence meant and how it influenced his views? It's his interpretation versus many others of his
Yeah, and
contemporaries.
actually, that is a great way to transition to my answer, because when you say it is his interpretation, what I guess if I learn, people sometimes say, hey, what did you learn about writing the book? People think, oh, I've already have all these answers and I'm just going to put it in a book. But the fact of the matter is as you are writing, you're rethinking, you're bringing coherence to what you thought was pretty ordered up here. And what I was astounded by most was precisely the fact that Lincoln wasn't the only one who had an opinion about the founders, and a favorable one. Almost everybody, I say almost. Alexander Stephens is an outlier, future vice president of the Confederacy, but a fellow Whig with Lincoln in between 1847 and 1849, the only term he was in Congress. But what I was astounded by was in the 1850s that there was an actual debate about the founders. It wasn't the debate, should we follow them or shouldn't we? It was, no, I have the accurate, I'm going to wrap myself in the mantle of Jefferson or the founding generation, Hamilton and Madison, et cetera. No. I'm the legitimate descendant and heir, or my party is, et cetera. And so it might be putting it simplistically, but I would say that the battle for America in the 1850s, especially in the late 1850s, was really a battle of whose interpretation of the founding was most persuasive to the American people as not only being true about the meaning of the country, but how to keep the country from falling apart.
Yeah, that it reminds me of the Lincoln quote about how, in using the same word, liberty, we don't all mean the same thing. And it's, diametrically opposed, cannot exist together definitions of that word. So this is, in the 1850s, leading up to the 1860 presidential election, there are 4 candidates, right? So we've got Lincoln as the Republican nominee, Stephen Douglas as the Democrat, Breckinridge as the Southern Democrat, and then John Bell for Constitutional Union. How did their views on the meaning and the ideals of the American founding, who was putting on that mantle and how were they interpreting it, and how did those conflict?
The most pitched battle was between the Northern Democratic standard bearer, Stephen Douglas, longtime rival of Lincoln's, and Abraham Lincoln. It's only the second time that the Republican Party had put forth a candidate, a nominee for the presidency. Breckinridge from Kentucky, his principal objective was to get a federal slave code. And so they were much more focused on policy, and it was going to be their way or the highway. If they didn't get their way, then it was pretty clear South Carolina was going to lead, and then all the other, and well, they would hope all the other slave states would follow. All but 4 eventually did, 7 before Lincoln took office, and then 4 after the firing on Fort Sumter. And when Lincoln called out the militia, then Virginia, North Carolina, Arkansas, and Tennessee followed suit. So even though on the one hand, I say mostly everybody wanted the founders on their side. And if you read the secession ordinances, in fact, or if you read their speeches, they mimic the Declaration of Independence. They borrow the rhetoric. They don't say anything about all men are created equal. But you know what comes up a lot, actually, is the word equality. But they don't mean, like you say, everybody is in favor of liberty, but the liberty of the slaveholder is different than the liberty of the slave. The slaveholding South understood by equality 2 things. One, the equality of the states. They understood the United States Constitution as a compact of states, as a league or an alliance, not a real national government with teeth. The other form of equality, when you see it, you'll find that word equal, but it's not human equality. No way, no way. The other equal, and this is the great irony, is they thought all Americans should be treated equally in terms of their property as they take their property into any federal territory. That territory was fought and bled for by my pappy or my brother or my grandpappy. I deserve, and by the way, you can't discriminate against me if I take all of my property there, which of course includes chattel slaves, and say those for Breckinridge and Southern Democrats, they asked of Stephen Douglas one thing in 1860. And because he said no, and believe me, he wanted to be president. Because he said no, that was the split in the Democratic Party that provided an opportunity, not a guarantee, but an opportunity that the right Republican could run the table in the North and West and get the sufficient number of electoral votes to become president. Douglas said no when they asked for a federal slave code demanding an enforcement of the Dred Scott opinion of 1857, which said that they had a constitutional right, expressly stated in the Fifth Amendment, to not have their property deprived of them without due process of law. Stephen Douglas said, find somebody else. And that's what ruined the Democratic Party and ultimately ruined Douglas's own chances to become president. He was more beholden to, of course, as you know, the policy of popular sovereignty. Let the locals decide, whether in territories or in states. He thought that federal principle was going to be the glue that kept the Union together. And Lincoln, of course, disagreed. We're spending too much time on Lincoln's enemies.
No. I want to spend more time on Lincoln's enemies because you just mentioned popular sovereignty. And this is where, Lincoln understood that the US Constitution fell short of the aspirations, that it was a compromise, right?
Yes.
He also, he knew that there were additional compromises, so-called, Missouri Compromise, Kansas, Nebraska, that were effectively moving the goalposts a little bit. They were all still compromises, but it was allowing slavery to expand, which he did not think was, the original vision of the founding fathers.
Right.
But Lincoln's adversary, Stephen Douglas, his chief adversary, he was taking the conversation away from this idea of compromise or a federal law and focusing on this issue of popular sovereignty. Can you talk about that a little bit more and why Lincoln found that argument so alarming?
Yeah, it really comes to the head, and any decent Lincoln biography will tell you this, but go ahead and read my book first. It's really the passage of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where Douglas says, hey, I'm not taking sides. This territory north of the 3630 parallel established by the 1820 Missouri Compromise, he decides to split it into two territories. Nebraska becomes Kansas and Nebraska. And he says, hey, slavery, Congress should butt out. So popular sovereignty really should be called either local popular sovereignty or congressional non-intervention or non-interference. In other words, Congress, unlike in 1820, when it said, okay, Missouri, you can come in with your slaves. And when you reach the right amount of population, you can become a slave state, and we're not going to hold that against you. But the balance of that remaining portion of the Louisiana territory above the 3630 parallel, excluding Missouri, slavery is forever banned. And that included the Nebraska territory. Okay. So Lincoln was content with 1820, as was the rest of the country, almost to a man. He even held his breath in 1850. Remember, 1850, he's out of office. And people say, oh, he kind of ducked out of politics. He was a politico. So he always had at least a big toe, if not two big toes in politics. Henry Clay is still alive. And Lincoln still, he thinks he's a Whig until 1856, probably the only one. So even the notorious Fugitive Slave Act that is revised, the 1793 one revised in 1850, Lincoln is willing to grit his teeth with that because California comes in as a free state. Texas comes in, even you think everything's big in Texas. It came in smaller. We created the Panhandle. Utah, New Mexico, they applied popular sovereignty to those territories. What else? Maine's already in. What else? Oh, the ban, not on slavery, but on the slave trade in the District of Columbia. So Lincoln thinks on balance, and because there was a palpable threat of secession. There was a secession convention in Tennessee in 1850. precisely because they thought they got ripped off with California because California skipped territory status and went straight to statehood. And they're like, whoa, 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 we didn't get a chance. That's not fair. Lincoln thought, okay, the Fugitive Slave Act is awful on its face, not just in its implementation, on the letter, it's awful. If this keeps the country together and we're still pointed towards getting rid of slavery, hence the DC ban on the slave trade, Lincoln says, okay, this is an America that I still recognize. But when Douglas decides to put Nebraska, Kansas, Nebraska, back on the table, wait, hold it, back on the table? Wait, you ate your half of the sandwich and now you want to put my half on the table for a debate? Lincoln's like, no, that's not fair. And in fact, he thinks Congress, contrary to Stephen Douglas, does and ought to exercise authority with regards to whether slavery should go in or not. And it's at that point that he jumps back into politics with both feet. He almost becomes senator. Later that year, he is it 5 votes short in January when the state legislature meets? And would you believe it? 5 anti-Nebraska Democrats, but Democrats, and they will not vote for a Whig. Lincoln gives permission to the 46 guys who had voted for him to vote for Lyman Trumbull instead of Matson, a pro-Nebraska Democrat. And it was tough for Lincoln to do. But I think I can honestly say, even though he was an ambitious man, he was loyal to principle in that move. But he almost became senator that year as a result. And of course, he's going to tangle with Douglas for the balance of the decade. But on this issue of popular sovereignty, Lincoln says, essentially, what you are telling, who cares about the South? Slavery in this country is not going to be determined by persuasive Southern slave owners. No. All you have to do to get America to make slavery national is teach white Northerners, not that slavery is good, but I did say white, didn't I?
Yeah.
Teach white Northerners not to care what happens to Black people somewhere else. And in this case, it was the territory of Nebraska, but it could have been Oregon. It could have been a whole mess of other territories. All you have to do is to get whites in the free states to acquiesce, go along with what a small minority of whites will decide to do in this territory and that territory, compounded by the awful Dred Scott opinion of 1857. Lincoln says, we're on our way to making slavery national, and nobody really endorsed it, if that makes sense. And so that's what brought him in big time. And he said, if we're going to save this country, and he said this in 1854, his great Peoria address, arguably, I think one of the top 3 speeches he ever delivered. He says, if we're going to save this country, we have to save it so that it is worthy of the saving. And that was his way of saying, oh, we can survive as a union of the states, but if it's a slaveholding union, Washington and the founders are rolling or spinning in their graves.
Yeah. So you touched on how this is playing out legislatively in presidential campaigns, how the parties, what their platforms are, what they're looking for. And then you just referenced the Dred Scott decision. So then that gets into the judicial branch. Can you go a little more into how the Dred Scott decision and Lincoln's response to that amped up his concerns about these popular sovereignty arguments? What is the lethal combination of those two, if you will? Yeah,
and the lethal combination, it's interesting because Stephen Douglas tried to say he was in favor of both, but Lincoln forced him in the Lincoln-Douglas debates to side. He said they're a contradiction. You can't be in favor of both. And ultimately, Douglas famously says, if a local territorial legislature passes unfriendly legislation, which is to say legislation that bans slavery from the territory, Douglas says that's totally legit, which of course is in the face of a Supreme Court 7-2 ruling. And according to the Constitution, right, that's the supreme law of the land. The Constitution, all treaties and laws passed in pursuance thereof, supreme. How supreme is supreme? No state law, and therefore by implication, no territorial law can contravene it. But what Dred Scott ruled was 2 things in particular. One, it ruled that any Black person could not be considered a citizen of the United States. And the case should have stopped right there, because if Dred Scott and Harriet Scott, his wife, were not citizens, they were not allowed, they didn't have standing, they were not allowed to bring their suit to the Supreme Court to begin with. And typically, the lower court, the circuit court, should have just thrown it out. And Taney should have just sent it back and said, hey, you messed up. Why did you hear this case? They're not citizens. Taney went on to say, oh, and about that Missouri Compromise back in 1820, you remember when Congress said that slavery couldn't go in those territories? Where do they get off? Congress doesn't have that authority. Fifth Amendment says you cannot be denied your life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Congress, you can't just legislate away somebody's property rights. And so they invented a federal slave right in the Constitution, which of course was a right for white people, not everybody. And Douglas tried to play both, tried to talk out of both sides of his mouth. I support the Dred Scott ruling, and Lincoln and those Republicans are the radicals. They're the revolutionaries. They're the ones, forming mobs in the streets, telling people not to obey. And of course, Lincoln said, nobody's saying that at all. We have to obey this ruling, but we disagree with it as a precedent. And we're going to try to persuade people that the Supreme Court made a mistake. And we will take a peaceful, which is to say, a political avenue to try to get them to change their minds, which means what? Elect people like Lincoln. And you get enough senators to do that, and get somebody to bring a case before them. And, well, you don't get the case until the Congress, quote unquote, makes a mistake. Have Congress pass a law banning slavery in the territories. Someone will say, wait a second, Dred Scott says I do have this right. Congress says I don't. Supreme Court would have to take the case, and they would rule on it again. And the Republicans would hope that they would change their minds. Unfortunately, Taney, of course, stays on the court until 1864. So we never got to see how that panned out because Civil War and whatnot. But that's what, when you say it ramped things up. Oh yeah, in 1857, when you have a 7-2 decision and the Chief Justice writing the opinion saying that essentially that the Constitution guarantees the right to own slaves in territories. Well, if they have a right in territories, why don't they have a right in any state that they travel to? And all we needed was that case. And Lincoln called it, all we need is a second Dred Scott opinion, which will make this country a slaveholding country nationally. And that's why he said, we don't resist the opinion in Dred Scott. We have to obey it. The court has ruled. We believe in the rule of law. Too bad for Dred Scott. Turns out his owner freed him within a month. But too bad for Dred Scott or any similarly situated. But we're going to try to get the court to change its mind. If Congress messes up, we try to get them to change their minds. Ditto for presidents. We're going to treat the Supreme Court the same way.
Yeah. So if the Dred Scott, well, actually taking a step back, if eliminating the slave trade in the District of Columbia is a step forward, the Dred Scott decision feels like a step back. And we know that progress isn't linear. You can have steps moving forward and back in the same years. Change, new ideas represented by Stephen Douglas and Justice Taney, not synonymous with improvement, of course. So
right.
How did, if Lincoln is referring back to the founders and saying, whoa, our Republican robe is soiled. And
yes,
he makes these references to the fact that we are going astray from the original vision. You have people you referenced earlier, Alexander Stephens, who take a very different approach in saying, you know what, the founders had it wrong. How did Lincoln's views differ from Alexander Stephens? And
yeah, Alexander Stephens, he's an interesting fellow for a number of reasons. As I mentioned, he got to know Lincoln. They became friends in the one term that when Lincoln served in Congress, 1847 to 1849. They were both Whigs. They were both members of the same party. Lincoln actually writes a friend writes from the District of Columbia back home, and he says, my eyes are still wet after listening to a speech of Alexander Stephens. And I went and actually looked up that speech, and let's just say Lincoln was slightly exaggerating, but he was impressed by what Stephens had said on that occasion. So they knew each other. Stephens in November gives a speech to the Georgia legislature arguing against secession, not in principle, but in terms of it being imprudent. He says, in short, Georgia has thrived as a state as being part of the Union. If we secede, we're really rolling the dice. We shouldn't do this. Thomas Cobb and other people shout him down and say, you're an idiot. I can't believe you're a Georgian, blah, blah, blah. Well, lo and behold, he actually then becomes the vice president of the Confederacy. And he gives a kind of an outlier speech. As I mentioned earlier, most secessionists, they wanted Washington on the seal. They wanted to link their, if you will, separation with the American colonial separation from Great Britain. So they were doing everything rhetorically to make it look like what they were doing was no different from the founders.
American Revolution Part 2.
Absolutely.
Right.
Redux, absolutely. Stevens in March says, I think it's March, his famous or infamous cornerstone speech says, you know what, Jefferson and all that Locke and Enlightenment stuff, the founders, they actually believed in the equality of the races. And if that were true, it would make sense, blah, 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 blah. He says they built on a sandy foundation. They were wrong. Wrong in the eyes of God, wrong in the eyes of natural law. He says they were wrong coming and going. And so Stevens says that the beauty of, and it's a speech defending the new Confederate Constitution that he helped draft. It's in that speech, he's saying the great thing about the Confederacy isn't that it protects slavery. A bunch of countries from time immemorial protected slavery, back to ancient times, pre-ancient times. What's new and innovative about the Confederacy is that ours is based on race. And they use the phrase more than one occasion, Negro slavery. He says, we have discovered the best way to do slavery. And it's when you have a superior race controlling an inferior race. And so he makes white supremacy the crown jewel, if you will, of the Confederate States of America's Constitution. What doesn't Lincoln like about that? If Lincoln had to pick one principle of the Declaration of Independence and put all the chips on the table, it's the very first self-evident truth that's mentioned. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And some people criticize Lincoln for when he criticizes slavery, he doesn't say enough, like Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? He doesn't kind of work on your emotions and bring in the pathos and make the emotional appeal. And Lincoln's like, I got to get votes. I have to talk to white people and give them reasons to vote. And by the way, in Illinois, of course, even though they only had like 6,000, 7,000 Black people, hundreds of thousands of white people, only 6,000, 7,000 Black people, they don't have the right to vote. So what Lincoln has to do is show white people why it's in their self-interest to make sure at least that the natural rights of Black people are protected. Why? Because those are the same rights white people have. He says, if we go back to the Declaration, we'll learn not race, but our common humanity is the foundation of our freedom, of self-government, of government by consent, and even the right of revolution. It's not our race. Yes, even a slaveholder like Jefferson, Madison, Washington, slaveholders, all of them, and they all believed what? Every human being, male, female, Black, white, everywhere in between, possessed natural rights. Jefferson called these sacred rights in a deleted paragraph from the Declaration of Independence where he condemns the slave trade.
Mm-hmm. I don't think it's necessarily intuitive to a lot of people that Abraham Lincoln and the vice president of the Confederacy would be in total agreement that the American founders absolutely believed in racial equality.
That's right.
It's just that the Confederacy said they were wrong, right? Exactly. So it's one of those things that they actually agreed on what they meant.
Yep.
Building on what you just said, Abraham Lincoln once wrote, I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong. I cannot remember when I did not so think and feel. He thought it was morally wrong. Morality and legality, he understood, were not the same thing. They were guided by different rules, if you will.
Sure.
As a US representative, he tried to introduce legislation to end slavery in the district where he felt the federal government had that authority. Exactly. But he also thought the federal government had the authority to end slavery in the territories, as you mentioned, or at least make decisions about it there. That is all different than being an abolitionist. And you mentioned people like Harriet Beecher Stowe and their rhetoric. What set Lincoln's view of the founders and the Constitution apart from that of abolitionists?
That's a great question. And it's a question that my students, and I teach a seminar on Lincoln statesmanship. So I put my cards on the table right at the beginning. I think he's no ordinary bear when it comes to politics. He's a really good one. So I call the course Lincoln statesmanship. my students, it takes them a few sessions to figure out that abolitionism isn't synonymous with anti-slavery. And it has to do with your understanding of the Constitution. It has to do with your understanding of a connection between means and ends. Lincoln believed consent, government by consent of the governed, was the flip side of the equality coin. And so abolitionists like, and I'm going to make this one easy and pick on somebody like William Lloyd Garrison, he was an immediatist, pacifist. He hated the Constitution because it was a bargain with slaveholders. He was all about equality, could care less about consent, right? God and I are a majority. Stephen Douglas was all about consent, local popular sovereignty, as long as the locals were white, not so much about equality. And Lincoln said, no, they're two sides of the same coin, okay? So government can only do what you've given them consent or authority to do. Nobody can tell me what to do unless they've asked my permission, government by consent. And so what made Lincoln anti-slavery, but not abolitionist, is he did not believe that the federal Constitution, underlying federal, invested or vested powers with Congress, let alone a president, to touch property in the states. And since slavery was an antecedent institution, it existed prior to not only prior to the Constitution, prior to the Declaration, right? Because it was what was known as a domestic institution, the federal government could only touch it as it affected the states touching each other or their outward face to either the Indian tribes, as they called it, or foreign powers. So could they touch the slave trade? After January 1, 1808, they could and did. A bill signed by Jefferson in March of 1807 to take effect as soon as possible. So Lincoln was adamant as a Whig and especially as a Republican because he didn't want the Republicans to become known as an abolitionist party. Stephen Douglas was doing everything he could to tar them with that brush. He was saying, look, the federal government can't touch slavery in the states where it already exists. We have to respect it. Why? Because we have not, as a federal government, been given permission. We have no more permission over slavery in those states than France does, or Canada, or Mexico. Okay, it's a federal government. It's limited to interstate matters and international matters. But where the federal government can act, the district, federal territories, and internationally, Lincoln says, look at the founders. And in the early generation, slaveholders though they were trying as a first step to prevent further supply and further expansion. Northwest Ordinance of 1787 being the fundamental example of that. And so once my students see that, oh, wow, what makes Lincoln anti-slavery is, as you say, both a moral and a legal thing, but politically what keeps him from becoming an abolitionist is because, in short order, in one word, he's a constitutionalist. His understanding of the Constitution was that it was not empowered to touch slavery. I'm going to mention another abolitionist real quick. So Garrison makes it too easy because he hates the Constitution. He's like Adams in this sense, John Quincy Adams, let justice be done though the heavens fall. Frederick Douglass. I mean, my favorite abolitionist, Frederick Douglass. His Constitution isn't quite Lincoln's Constitution. He's shaped by guys like Gerrit Smith, Lysander Spooner, Wendell Phillips, and let's just say they have a more expansive understanding of a number of clauses, especially those that were compromises with slavery, because the word slave is never used. They have a more expansive understanding of the power of the federal government. And Frederick Douglass had no problem whatsoever saying that Congress could touch slavery anywhere it existed in America. And in that sense, he and Lincoln did not see eye to eye. And I hate to say that because I love them both.
But your point is that he did see that working within the framework
yes,
was important, right? So
exactly.
you've referred to the U.S. Constitution as the body and the Declaration of Independence as the soul.
Yes.
And then in your book, you also reference the proverb, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Can you share Lincoln's reflections on that?
Oh my goodness.
I know, I'm sorry. And what he saw is essentially the generational responsibility and challenge.
Yeah. quickly, he actually got the idea of apples of gold being the equality principle, what he paraphrased as liberty to all in a private note to himself, that the apples of gold were equality, everybody possesses liberty, and the settings of silver, the frame or the platter, as it were the union of the states and the Constitution. He saw those, as much as he valued those, they were means to an end. If you forget the end, then that platter can hold garbage, let alone apples of gold. And of course, he thought precisely, you gut the soul of the Constitution, and guess what people are thinking? Oh, we can make this country a slaveholding country. Sure, and you don't have to amend a single part of the Constitution. So when Alexander Stephens, gosh, this guy keeps popping up, he writes to Lincoln after Lincoln is elected, and he says, hey, I don't think you should wait till March 4th, 1861. The country needs to hear from its president-elect to save our common country, as he puts it. He said, words from you now would be like apples of gold and pictures of silver. Lincoln never writes back to Stephens quoting that proverb, but Lincoln's like, I know that proverb, 25 verse 11. And you know what he says to himself in a note in January? He says, the country doesn't need new words from their new president. They need old words, the words of the fathers. Liberty to all. He says, this has been the key to American prosperity. It clears the path for all, enterprise for all, industry to all. Prosperity was a theme for Lincoln in the last 3 or 4 years before he ran for president. And it's one he repeats almost verbatim in a State of the Union address, December, I think, of 61. And so Stephens got him thinking about apples of gold, pictures of silver. They're both valuable, but the apples of gold are the most valuable thing. What are the apples of gold in the United States? It's equality, human equality. That's what's got to be our saving grace, or we're not worth being a country anymore.
That seems, I so appreciate that that analysis and that reflection. And it reminds me of, in the Gettysburg Address, how Abraham Lincoln goes back to the old words, the old time, the past.
Yeah.
And then uses that kind of language to explain what he saw as the present challenge and
yeah. What you mentioned as the present challenge, this isn't something that will get solved. like people are like, oh, we're polarized, or we headed towards civil war. I'm like, yes, we're polarized. No, we're not headed towards civil war, but things are kind of dire. How do we get out of this? Even if we get out of it, this is the responsibility of every generation. And what Lincoln thought was, we were essentially undergoing an identity crisis. Some people said the Constitution owes me this. Other people say it owes me that. When you get to that, you really are in a pretty sticky situation because and we learned this from Aristotle. If a people have two different notions of justice, you really have two different nations, because your expectation of what government is supposed to afford you and protect you are two different expectations. You no longer have different means towards the same ends. Now it seems like you have different ends. Yikes. And so what Lincoln was trying to do, he thought the safest and best way was to do what the founders did, and found out, hey, why don't we figure out what it is that we all share, what we all have in common, and therefore what we can all reasonably expect our government to do, which is to secure rights. Who has rights? Are you a person? You got rights, right? It's your birthright. And government's job is to protect that. And so Lincoln thought, if I take people back to that, and he actually used the words, we need to re-adopt the Declaration of Independence, right? You said our Republican robe is soiled. It's the same, It's the same speech, the Peoria Address, 1854. Lincoln said, this is the rhetoric. This is the way we as citizens need to speak to each other. And I mean rhetoric in the highest sense, the way we ought to try to persuade one another, that these words, that these principles have eternal, fixed, true value and meaning. Frederick Douglass agreed with that. Even William Lloyd Garrison believed that these were fixed truths. And why I think Lincoln, and therefore this book that I wrote, is timely is because it's an invitation for people to see if Lincoln has any saliency. In other words, if Lincoln's words, especially those that were brought through the muse of the founders, can we have faith that equality, rights, consent, that these things can mean the same thing for all of us. That has to be the basis of our politics. And if it doesn't, notice what not will happen, what is already happening.
Yeah.
Then politics simply becomes popular sovereignty. It simply becomes crude majoritarianism. And no wonder you want a majority on the Supreme Court or a majority in Congress or the president of your party. Because if you're not, how do you know that as a minority numerically, what the things that you value and are important and believe that you share with other people, how do I know those are going to be protected? If I'm not in the majority, I shouldn't be scared about my rights simply because I'm outnumbered. Quickly, 1856, the Republicans lost. They did not say, not my president to Buchanan. They didn't preach resistance. They did the American way. Try again. 1858, they got more seats in the Congress. 1860, a second bite of the presidential apple, and Lincoln pulled it off. Where Fremont failed, Lincoln found those 3 or 4 more northern states, got those 180 votes. Some Americans were not willing to be good losers. A republic requires good winners and good losers. And I don't know that we have the language to be good losers right now. We're so intent on being the winners that if we don't win, then it's, well, bad things happen.
Yeah, and we are in, another one of those moments where there are incompatible definitions of rights and issues that are causing some of that polarization. I'm going to turn to audience questions in a moment, but before I do, we've spent this wonderful time together talking about competing interpretations of the founders, and what that meant on the eve of and during the Civil War. Likewise, there have been competing interpretations of the Civil War over time.
Sure.
Of course, the lost cause narrative and how that influenced policy and other decisions afterwards. And it's interesting to me because similar to Lincoln's analysis, and I admit, fine, it's his interpretation, but he was going back and looking at the actual words and the laws that were being passed. And if you go back and look at what the Confederacy was saying, the cornerstone speeches you mentioned, the lost cause doesn't hold up. That narrative doesn't make sense. This has happened time and again throughout our history. It's not unique to our country, but it certainly does happen here a fair bit. All the way up to the present, it's not an exaggeration to say that there's a crisis of democracy worldwide right now. Based on your experience in history and education, how does one do their part to break through that? How have you persuaded people to engage with the historical evidence, to rededicate to the very worthy founding principles to make real progress?
Yeah, I would say it's not just in my Lincoln class. It is part of my pedagogy, fancy way of saying this is how I teach. You mentioned that I do a number of high school teacher workshops. I love working with high school teachers. They're some of my best students because they're reminded of why they got into the profession to begin with, is they just dig history. We have all this controversy over 1619 project and what were the founders really doing with the Declaration and all that kind of stuff. And I'm saying, number one, we should not be afraid of our history. We are a country born of complete agreement. No, we are a country born of debate, discussion, sometimes real fights. But thankfully, most of those discussions were resolved peacefully, which is to say, politically, the Civil War being the glaring outlier. And so what I am trying to do in my own teaching, whether it's a class on political philosophy, my race and equality class especially, but also my Lincoln class, is, in short, I try to make it a fair fight. I have a course entitled Lincoln Statesmanship. If you're a hater of Lincoln, please take my course. Not so that I could persuade you that Lincoln is the man, but I want to show you I'm going to make it a fair fight. I'm not going to assume you're a neo-Confederate. I want you to wait. Secession? What? Lost cause? You know what? Why don't we read their declarations? Why don't we read their letters to each other when the Deep South was writing the Upper South, slaveholding states? Charles Dew's book, Apostles of Disunion, excellent, slender, scholarly book, where he shows that it wasn't the tariff. It was all about white supremacy. The more accurate title is Apostles of White Supremacy. The disunion was about whites controlling blacks. They thought if a Republican administration comes into power, not only are they going to be freed, they're going to get to vote, which of course was not true, but the worst things are going to happen to our white wives and lily white daughters, et cetera. I mean, you can't make, you can't make this stuff up. It's in the record. So if I'm teaching Aristotle, I'm also teaching Machiavelli, right? I mean, good grief. I have to teach things I don't personally agree with, but I want to show students that they don't need to be afraid of pursuing, if the point of education is knowledge, moving from mere opinions about things to knowledge about them. We do that in science. We can do that in the humanities and in social sciences. Race and equality. I don't just make half the course Frederick Douglass. You know, we're reading, you know, Malcolm X, we're reading Black Power, we're reading the 1619 Project, we're reading critical race theory. I teach, there it is nationally. You know, I read in a Virginia newspaper that apparently somebody thinks at this newspaper that critical race theory is not being taught at colleges. I'm like, are you in America? I taught it this last semester, but I made it a fair fight. I quoted from critical race theorists, and then I quoted from some of their critics. So I'm trying to show my students that they don't have to be afraid of the truth, that the truth will out if you make it a fair fight. Frederick Douglass called this not just the right to speak, but the right to hear. He would be first in line criticizing today's cancel culture. He says, we couldn't have had abolition if we didn't have free speech.
Well, and we know that Lincoln practiced that himself. He was often trying to read and understand the opposing viewpoints.
All
it
the
made
time.
him better at debate. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. You have to understand the opposition if you're going to debate and engage with them.
Yep.
Absolutely. So first question, Melvin asks, if Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation if he had issued the Emancipation Proclamation in July 1861, how successful would it have been?
It would have been a disaster. It would have been like he told the Chicago ministers in the summer of 1862 when he already had a draft of it, but didn't let them know he was waiting for an opportune time. In other words, a time where it would show he could actually back it up. He said it would be like the papal bull against the comet. It would be like, okay, you can say what you want about the stars and planets, but they're going to do what they're going to do, right? You don't have control over those things. And so Lincoln did not believe it was a military necessity then. He probably would have had entire regiments, if not entire quotas of certain states, say, just turn around and go home. They would not have been in favor of what was known at the time as an abolition war. It would have confirmed the worst fears of the South. It would have said, see, we told you. Lincoln was just champing at the bit to get rid of slavery. All this time he said, Congress, let alone the president, doesn't have power over it. Here you go. And so unlike Frederick Douglass, who thought the president should have done it on day one, I think if Lincoln had done it when he called Congress back into session on July 4th, 1861, I don't think he would have gotten Congress's support. I think the quotas that he had called for, and of course, states like Kentucky didn't fulfill their quota, et cetera. Lincoln, that would have been probably the most imprudential thing. And I hate to say it because it's emancipation we're talking about. He would have said, let's try fighting first. Let's try using force. We've been shot at. They started it. It's a war of self-defense. Let's do what we can now. And I have clear supermajority support in the West and the South, in the West and the North to fight a war of self-defense. Let's do this first. Yeah. We cannot touch slavery because then it would go against what the Republican Party stated in their platform. It would go against everything I've said prior to being president. I would be a man of no integrity if I did that.
Yeah, interesting. Robert asks, how would you rank the Cooper Union speech among Lincoln's more famous speeches with regard to justifications based on the original documents?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting speech because while it has some very stirring language, most of it is if you watch Sam Waterston, and he's a great Lincoln reenactor, they actually did this for C-SPAN or CNN where he actually did it verbatim. I have read that speech and taught that speech countless times, but it was only after listening to Sam Waterston read that speech, I thought, Oh my goodness, Lincoln, that first third is brutal. It is just all, I mean, he's assiduous in counting who are the original 39 or whatever. And it is painstakingly not legal, but it is so detailed in trying to figure out who are the real, who do we count as the founders and who voted what? And these were the majority. It's something better read than said. Let's put it that way. That said, the rest of this, I mean, and it does its job, but his speech where he rejects Southern criticisms of the Republican Party, and then the closing part where it's an exhortation of the Republican Party, there is some great stuff there. So without question, the Cooper Institute speech, even though I just ran it down, is I think one of the top 6 speeches of Lincoln's. But given its length and given the, where he's just fighting, tit for tat against Stephen Douglas in that first third, almost the first half of the speech. It ain't the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah, that's for sure. So Richard would like to know, first, did you give any thought about when Lincoln had his initial exposure to the founding documents? And second, how does his interpretation of the founding documents evolve as his political career progressed?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. No, I didn't try to track down, I didn't do a word search, and this is fairly easy to do with the online collected works of Abraham Lincoln, with one exception. You need to know that if a word that you're searching is in italics, it won't find it. So you've got to be fairly conversant with Lincoln's speeches and writings to use it effectively, but you could do a word search and find out. He quotes Washington. He cites Washington by name in the Lyceum Address, and that's 1838. So this is his second term as a state legislator in the lower house in Illinois. And, he first ran for office in 1832. So it's pretty early that Lincoln is already doing his homework. He says in his speech at Trenton on the way to his first inauguration that he read Parson Weems', I'm going to put this in scare quotes, biography of George Washington. It's the chopping of the cherry tree and I cannot tell a lie. Parson Weems was not only not a real biographer, he was not even a parson. But at any rate, Lincoln was moved by the story of Washington's character, and that was a book to shape the souls of young men. Okay, it was supposed to shape their character. Lincoln is a voracious reader, like Frederick Douglass, self-taught. He reads everything he can get his hands on, except for novels. He doesn't like novels or philosophy. He loves Shakespeare. He loves the poetry of Burns, and of all things, political economy. He devoured political economy as a Whig in his 4 straight terms as a state legislator. In terms of the founders, once Madison's notes become public, and that happens after he dies, so that's, 1840, 1845. We know that Lincoln reads Eliot's debates, the constitutional debates, so he's read Madison's notes. He starts reading up on the historical period of the founding fairly early when he turns his eye to national politics. So in answer to that specific question, I can't cite you chapter and verse in terms of what year or month that Lincoln really pursues this in earnest, but it's clear, certainly by 1854, when he, as I say, comes back into politics with both feet, he has done most of his reading already of what's publicly available. And of course, when he was a congressman, he had the best library in the world, which was the Library of Congress between 1847 and 1849. Here's an interesting footnote, and I would love to be corrected on this. I don't know that Lincoln read the Federalist Papers. Ooh, there are passages in Lincoln that I go, wait, this reminds me of something Madison said. But he will quote Madison, but Douglas quotes the Federalist Papers. I don't ever see Lincoln either explicitly quoting a passage, and I'm fairly conversant. I teach the Federalist when I teach American government. I would love to see a paper or somebody try to prove me wrong on this, because I love the Federalist and Lincoln. But if he's got the Library of Congress, how is he not reading the Federalist Papers? So I don't know, news to me.
That's interesting. Let's squeeze in one more question if we can.
Okay, I'll be quick, I promise.
Yeah. Patricia asks, what aspects of slavery do you consider being still in effect in the USA?
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's the last question. I mean, it's clear that there's human trafficking that's still going on. So that is, I mean, that's the easy one. That's the low hanging fruit, unfortunately. So if you go in any airport, you'll see the signs that say, hey, if you see something, say something. So it is definitely still a reality here. It is a more palpable, unfortunate reality in other places in the world. I'm not going to be specific, but it would not take you long to figure out where there are places where people are enticed to go work and their passports are taken from them and withheld, and they are essentially enslaved as workers in these countries. So if the point of that question was to say that slavery isn't completely eradicated, yeah, I agree. And it's a tragedy that that's true.
Absolutely, especially given that, unlike during Lincoln's time, it is illegal in all countries around the world today. And yet there are, by most estimates, more people enslaved today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave
My
trade.
goodness.
So thank you for that, Lucas. That was wonderful. Phyllis, back to you.
Dr. Morel, I know everyone has really enjoyed tonight's program, and we are so glad that you joined us. One quick question. There were several that wanted to know how they could take your course. Is there a quick way to give them that information?
The course at WNL, you'd have to live around Lexington, Virginia, or Rockbridge County and ask to audit it. And I would give you permission for doing that, no problem. But I don't have, if it was something online or whatever, that would have to be under the auspices of some other organization. So there's no quick answer to that. But if you're interested, just email me and we'll see if there's a way.
Sounds like something we should explore. So.
For sure. All right. So if you haven't already registered for our upcoming webinars, then I would encourage you to visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org and sign up soon. Next up, plan to take a mid-afternoon break with us on Thursday, May 26th for our first virtual voyage. This one takes you to President Lincoln's Cottage, which is a historic site and museum located 3 miles north of the White House, where Lincoln and his family spent a quarter of his presidency. Virtual voyages are 45 minutes online field trips designed to provide a behind-the-scenes experience and ideas for your next real-life trip. So we hope that you will join us. To register for all of our future webinars, please visit our website at lincolnpresidential.org. Thank you all so much for joining us this evening and for your ongoing generous support. Until next time, good night.